welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are things that only one color can do. So, what do I mean by that? Well, there are a few things that only certain colors do, as we all know. There's the color pie, certain colors do certain things. Might seem like an odd video to do on a Commander deck building channel, but it is actually very relevant. Of course, this channel is EDH Deck Building. It's all about building Commander decks. And because we have that color identity in the Commander format, very important, a lot of times when you're building around a certain commander, there are certain things you want to do that maybe that color doesn't actually do, so you don't have access to it, right? So it is very important to look at the things that certain colors or color combinations can do and other colors can't do. And of course, there's always going to be exceptions. I know there's going to be lots of people in the comments giving me examples of where certain colors can do certain things. There's always going to be exceptions, and feel free to do so. If you want to throw some fringe examples in the comments, it's always great, again, for deck building purposes. That's why I make videos like this. For example, let's throw out counterspells, right? As soon as I say counterspells, the first thing everyone thinks of is blue, obviously. It is the color that does it best. In fact, whenever you talk about the color blue, probably the first thing most Magic players think of is counterspells. However, there is lots of examples of cards that are not blue that are countering spells. There's a bunch. In fact, I made an entire list of cards that aren't blue that are countering. You can go check that out if you want to. Even something like Extra Turns, which is considered obviously a blue ability, there are other colors that can do it, right? There's quite a few, in fact, non-blue cards that are taking extra turns. Nevertheless, I would still consider counter spells and extra turns to be a blue thing. I think most people would. And if you were building an extra turns deck, it would be incredibly difficult for you to do so without blue. Interesting deck idea, though, if anybody wants to go after that one. So let's start out with fighting. Fighting is that mechanic where, of course, your creature is going to deal damage to another creature and that creature deals it back to yours. That, of course, is a green mechanic. It's not only green, there is a little bit outside of green. It is a little bit in red. The punching mechanic as well, sometimes referred to as punching, where you're only dealing the damage in one direction, right? Which a lot of times can be better. Sometimes you actually want the damage to come back towards your creature, right? If you have a creature that wants to be dealt damage. For the most part, though, the fighting and the punching mechanic are predominantly green with, I would say, a little bit of red. Forcing blocks is a really big one. This one can be really important when building decks. Again, mostly a green mechanic. And what I mean by forcing blocks is those lure type of effects. All creatures able to block, enchanted creature do so, that kind of stuff. Or even just maybe one creature forcing it to block. Forcing blocks in general is a green mechanic. There are some artifacts out there that will do it. Grappling Hook does it. Nemesis Mask does it. That's why those cards often get used a lot in the Commander format. I go back to them a lot when I'm building decks because they are a non-green card. They're a colorless option for forcing blocks. Magnetic Web, another one that I've gone back to the well with a few times, is a way to force blocks in a colorless form because sometimes you want to be forcing blocks when you're not in a green deck, right? The Konda Lord of Iganju deck that I did on my Underwhelming Commander series, and I will be referencing that series quite a bit on this video for the exact reason that I'm making this video, which is I come across these commanders, they're underwhelming, there's certain things I want to be doing with them, and one of the things I want to be doing with Konda is forcing blocks because it has Bushido 5. Whenever it comes blocked, it gets +5/+5 until end of turn, and if I'm in a mono-white deck, of course, I don't have access to all those great green lure effects, so I gotta use those cards like Nemesis Mask and Magnetic Web in order to do so, right? That's why it can be very important in the Commander format to talk about certain colors doing certain things because color identity matters so much for us. How about exchanging? That is a big one. So when I'm talking about exchanging, what I mean is I'm going to give my opponent something and they're going to give me something of theirs. Of course, we all know this is a blue mechanic. And again, can be very important. Now, the exchange thing is interesting. Sometimes you actually want the exchange where I want to give something to my opponent and I want to take something of theirs. Sometimes you only want to give something to your opponent and sometimes you only want to steal something from your opponent. opponent, those can be divided into two. So the exchange thing is predominantly blue. If I only want to take something from my opponent, of course, I'm just stealing it, which is predominantly, I would say, a red thing. A lot of blue too. There's a lot of blue and red in there. There's a little bit of black maybe as well. Stealing is a lot more open-ended than the actual exchange theme. Donating is also sort of a sub-theme here. Donating is I'm just giving something to my opponent, right? There's no exchanging going on. I'm just going to give it to my opponent. Of course, we have the card for which it's named Donate, which is blue, and we also have the red version, Harmless Offering. Those are the two really most common and some of the only ways that you can do this if you want to actually give something to your opponent, usually something really, really bad, right? And again, when you're brewing an underwhelming commander, it can be really important. I talked about Yukoro the Prisoner in my commanders that are really difficult to build around video, because there's a commander that has a horrible downside. Whenever it leaves the battlefield, sacrifice all non-ogre creatures you control. That's a horrible downside to have on your commander, especially when there's not really an upside. And because it's mono black, I can't use any of those donate effects, right? I can't give this to my opponents, which is probably what you would want to do. I mean, think about it this way. If Yukoro the Prisoner was a blue commander, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense, but let's pretend Yukoro was a mono blue commander. I imagine it would be way more popular in the commander format because it would be incredibly easy for me to either donate it to my opponents or exchange it, right? I could just have Yukoro as my commander, exchange it with my opponent, take their really fantastic creature, give them my Yukoro, then I can blink it. They have to sacrifice all their non-ogre creatures. It comes back into play under my control, right? If this was a mono blue commander, it would be way more popular because you have access to all those exchange and donate mechanics, right? Another reason you might want to donate, again, going back to my underwhelming commander series, Ayumi the Last Visitor, one that I did on that series, has legendary land walk. It's a 7/3, so obviously I want to be getting in for damage, and if my opponent controls a legendary land, I can get in for damage without worrying about blocks. But of course, color identity is so important here, and mono green doesn't have any of those donate effects. And it's really nice for me to be able to donate a legendary land to my opponents to ensure my commander can't get blocked. I can just put a bunch of legendary lands in my deck, donate one to my opponent, and then my commander's unblockable. Unfortunately, in mono green, there isn't a lot of ways to do that. I talked about Gauntlets of Chaos in that video, and I've used this in a couple of decks now because it is, as far as I can tell, the only colorless way to exchange stuff. It's a 5-mana artifact, pay 5, sacrifice Gauntlets of Chaos, exchange control of target artifact, creature, or land you control, and the same permanent an opponent controls. So this is a way to exchange that is colorless. That's why a card like this, I think, is so important in the commander format, because sometimes you only have this option for exchanging or donating. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be an exchange. I just want to give my opponent a legendary land, so I take something of theirs, could be a basic plains, doesn't matter. The more important part is I want to give them a legendary land so that my commander's unblockable, right? So take note of this card, because again, I've mentioned it a few times because it is really important that there's a colorless option for this effect. Cloning or copying, of course, is mostly a blue effect. We do have some red stuff though. It's actually kind of surprising how good red is at this effect. There are a few of the one shot until end of turn things. That's sort of more how red does it. Blue can do the permanent create token copy of things. Red does the until end of turn create token copy things. So it can do it, doesn't do it as good as blue, I don't think. Usually you have to sacrifice it or exile at the end of turn, right? Flame Shadow Conjuring, probably the best example of this, where you are doing a copy thing. It's only your creatures. Very difficult to copy your opponent's creatures outside of blue. Again, I can't think of any cards that do it. If you can, let me know in the comments below. Typically though, the cloning or creating token copy of thing is going to be entirely blue or red a little bit. Of course, we just got Saw in Half from the Infinity set, which is now a black way to create a token copy of something. In fact, you're going to get the 2 copies, which is even better. That's why that card's probably going to be a popular card in the commander format, not only because it's a good card, but also because it is a black copy effect. Fling Effects, right? What are Fling Effects? Well, that's when I am going to sacrifice one of my creatures and then deal damage equal to its power to any target typically. And of course, as we all know, those are red effects. Again, something that you probably want to be doing in a lot of different commander decks. And if you're not in red, good luck. Not a lot of options there, right? Flinging is a red effect that you really can only do in red. Again, if you have any non-red options out there that you can think of, feel free to comment below, because someone might be in a deck where they want to be flinging their commander, for example, and they don't have access to red. How about color changing? As we all know, color changing can be really, really important, whether you are changing the actual color of a card or you're changing the text of something as well. You could throw that in there. Blue is typically the one that is doing this, although there are some great colorless options. Painter's Servant obviously being the best one. This is the best option for changing colors, period, because it's just going to change everything into a color of your choice. Distorting Lens is another favorite of mine that I go to often. 2-mana artifact. Tap, target permanent becomes the color of your choice until end of turn. So that's another great one-shot that you can use for changing the color of things. Of course, changing the color of things can be really, really important. Maybe just your commander has protection from a certain color. There's lots of commanders out there that have protection from certain colors, and it would be really nice to have a color changing effect in there to make your commander to have protection from just about anything. So color changing, typically a blue thing, but there are actually a couple of great colorless options there. Discard, obviously a black thing, right? If we're talking about looking at someone's hand, making them discard a card, that's pretty much entirely black. Not really something that you want to do in the commander format that much, though. That's, interestingly enough, something that is incredibly powerful to do in a 2-player format that you almost never see in commander is the, Thoughtseize, I look at my opponent's hand, take a card and make them discard it. So the fact that that's only in black, really not that much of a drawback because no one really uses it. Damage prevention is mostly a white thing, I would say, except when we get to the fog effects and then we're in green. I would say the fog effects, so preventing combat damage, that kind of stuff, is going to be white and green. I would say there's pretty close to an equal amount of both if you're looking for those kind of effects. Damage prevention outside of the fog effects, though, is predominantly a white thing, obviously. Just an absolute ton of options there if you want to be doing that. Switching power and toughness, a very fringe, unique effect. I don't know how often you're going to be wanting to do that, but it is interesting to look at these things. Switching power and toughness is a blue and red thing, I think. I'm thinking of, again, underwhelming commander deck that I did for Minichi the Fever Dream. That is a mono red commander that has that ability, although you typically think of it, I think, as a blue ability. There's lots of one-shot cards, instants, that are blue abilities that are switching power and toughness. And I will just end this video with +1/+1 counters, right? And this is something that you would think, okay, well, every color does this, right? Of course, black does it, white does it, blue does it, green does it. I would say probably green and white does it best, although there is a lot of nice support in +1/+1 counters with black, especially recently. I don't know how much stuff there is specifically in blue, although there's a lot of Simic stuff for +1/+1 counters, so obviously blue is included in there. Not a lot of red stuff, though. In fact, I just did a deck doctor for one of my patrons, Shimatsu the Blood Cloak, mono red commander. As it enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of permanents. Shimatsu enters the battlefield with that many +1/+1 counters on it, and I'm like thinking, what is there in mono red that is doing the +1/+1 counter theme? I can't think of anything. Of course, you have the colorless options. The Ozolith is something that you're going to want to put in any deck that's dealing with counters. Fantastic include there, but other than that, what is a mono red, right? I'll throw this out to my viewers. Anything in mono red that is dealing with +1/+1 counters. For the most part, I think red is the only color that doesn't have any support in the +1/+1 counter theme. Again, if you can think of anything, throw it in the comments. I want to see lots of comments on this video. In fact, it's not about being right or wrong. It's sort of helping with deck building. So lots of comments out there for suggestions, right? I love finding these cards like Gauntlets of Chaos and whatnot, where it's a colorless option or an option that people maybe don't know of, where they're building their commander deck, they're stuck in a certain color, they don't know there's any support in that theme, and maybe there are a couple options. So please comment below all of those cards that might sort of break the color pie or be a colorless option for doing something that people might not know exists. In fact, if I get a ton of suggestions for this, I might actually have to make another video about it because, again, it is really important in the commander format to have these options when you're building a commander deck, right? Anything else that only one color can do, or maybe certain certain colors do not have access to, let me know that as well in the comments below. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.